Hello and welcome to this video. Here the subject is the graduated filter in Adobe Camera Raw. Now this tool can be thought of as one of our strategic tools, those we select to continue our manipulation in just one part of the image after we've dealt with the global changes. As you can see, I've got an image open in Adobe Camera Raw. As far as I'm currently aware, I'm satisfied with all of the global edits that I've made to this image, but now I want to turn to dealing with some strategic areas, and I think the graduated filter is going to help me with this. If you've already seen the video I made for the adjustment brush, then you're going to see quite a number of similarities between that and the graduated filter. What I'm going to do is go up to the top of the screen. It's located right next door to the adjustment brush. There's the graduated filter. The shortcut key is G, and when I select it, all of the options open up on the right hand side, very similar to what we saw with the adjustment brush. Like the adjustment brush and also the radial filter that we'll be looking at later, any settings we applied previously will be remembered when we come back and reselect the tool. If we just look up the sliders on the right hand side, the only one that's got a change here is the exposure. So as it's only one, I'm going to reset that just by double clicking the pointer, and it'll reset back to the 0 option. What we need to do to apply the graduated filter is to click and drag. So I'm going to go to the area I want to work. I want to drag my graduated filter from the corner up. So that dragging process establishes the start of the gradient and the end. And we can move it afterwards, so it's not critical. So I'm going to click and drag. And because I've got no settings here, of course we don't see any instant change. As before, just like the adjustment brush, we can make as many of these as we wish, and we may be making 2 on this image. If I were to select to create another one, I can go to the new button here, but I can just go here, click and drag, and it will do it for me. And you'll notice it does a very similar thing to the adjustment brush in that it can only work on one gradient at a time. So the original one, the pins have been turned off, but when I hover over them you can see the mask. I'll turn my original one back on. The good thing about these is we can pick up these pins, we can move them to any location. We can do that before we add any adjustments over on the right or after. We can also rotate it any angle we want. Sometimes if we pick up these pins, it can be tricky to rotate. So sometimes if that happens, move further away, and if you move your cursor over the line, you'll see a double-headed arrow, and you might find that's just a little bit easier to control. So with the spinning round of the screen, let's begin with the actual editing of the graduated filter. But here's a little tip. When you're using the adjustment brushes, the graduated filter and also the radial filter, there is an opportunity down at the bottom here to turn the overlay on and off. Now, although when I've unticked that box the gradient on the left appears to have disappeared, it actually hasn't. It's still there, it's still live, and it's still working. Now that can be quite useful because sometimes the lines do get in the way when we're doing fine detail. So it's a choice, but here's a nice quick way to do it. If you like keystrokes, the V key will toggle any of these overlays on and off, whether it's the adjustment brush, radial filter, or this graduated filter. Touch it once and it disappears, touch it again and it returns. We'll start the process with it turned off or hidden. Now I think I need more density down at the bottom of the image, so what I'm going to do is to drop the exposure. I've got plenty of detail down there, so as I do so, we'll see the effect in the graduated filter, and we can decide how far we're going to go. I want to go a fair way and give it a fairly solid base. Now you can see that in doing that, it's also warmed up the ground a little bit. It's a little bit on the reddish side. Well, why don't we go up here and just drop the temperature down just a touch? Not much. That's probably all it needs. -14. But I'd like to tweak the actual gradient, so now I do need to touch that V key to bring it back into play. Remember that the green pin, which is just off our picture at the moment, is the start of the gradient. So down here you're going to have the greatest effect of the sliders that you move on the right hand side. But of course we've got a nice gentle gradient, and we can see it by just turning the mask on. But what I want to do here, I think, is to pick up the red pin and drag this further up, because I think that's going to look a lot better. Still think that's a little bit too warm, so maybe I'll go back here and just drop that down a little more. -23, -24. Now I want to go over the other side, click the pin, and now we can put a change into that gradient. This time I'll leave the gradient overlay in place, but I'll just drop down the exposure to what I think looks about right, and I'll drop down that temperature a little bit too. It was somewhere in the 20s there. Now over here it's easy to go too far, look, and drift into the blue. I don't want to go that far, so maybe a little less on the right hand side. But I also need to change the gradient too. I can drag this up to darken that foreground, and of course we can move the green pin as well. So if we wanted it to be up here somewhere, we can do it, but not really appropriate with this particular image. But there, if we want to come away from the gradient tool, we can click the zoom tool or the hand tool up at the top left. But again, it's more convenient to just touch the H key, because that just automatically selects the hand, brings us back to the basic tab, and we can just sit back and at least view what we've just done. So as you can see, the gradient tools are very useful, and I hope you'll agree with the changes I've made and that it does actually improve the image. I could even do the same thing at the top there if I wanted to take down some of the tones there, but I think they're not so bad. I'm quite happy with the rest. But what I have noticed is, and sitting back looking at the image for a few moments, I have noticed that an aircraft seems to be scraping the paint off of the sky here. So although we're not dealing with our spot removal tool, I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to adjust my brush. I'll start at that end, and I was going to drag actually, so I didn't get that quite right. I'll delete that. I'll click and just drag all the way down, touch the V key to make sure everything looks great. Well, there we are, another strategic change made. Here I have another image which I think is probably very well suited for a graduated filter. Of course, some people use graduated filters over the lens of their camera in situations like this, when the contrast is very high. Here we don't have quite those problems. The sun has already dipped below the horizon, so we don't have a high contrast issue here. But I think the left hand corner is weak, and I think the sky is weak, but all the midtones I think I've got just about right in the global editing. So let's quickly pick up the gradient tool, and I'll click down here and drag, try to get the angle right and bring it up to that point. What I want to do is to just take down the exposure, I think, on that foreground, and there you can see it. I think it's got a lot of clarity in there. Let's take that clarity off. I don't know, that looks quite good. Let's leave it up there quite high. Let's put a bit of dehaze, see if that improves things a little bit, not much. But that looks okay. I've given it a nice solid base. I think I may just drop the exposure just a tad more. But now I want to concentrate on the sky. So let's go to the top of the screen, click and drag. Now, just picking up those changes that I made a few moments ago, already we've got something which is looking pretty colourful. But it could be that the changes that it's picked up from the previous use is a bit over the top. So we can always go inside of any gradient filter, right click and reset the local correction settings. And there we are, back to where we started. And I think this is one of those nice situations where touching that V key and hiding the tool before we start making a change, often I find is nice to do. So we need to go up and decide exactly which of these sliders we're going to move. Now let's start by dropping down the exposure, and straight away we're getting a great improvement. What I'm going to do to add to that is to add a bit of dehaze. Now I really like what it's doing up there, but I'm going to move it a little bit more to the right. I like the darkness that we can see creeping in here, but I'm not happy with that blue. So before I proceed with my graduated filter, I'm going to have to leave it and go to the hue, saturation and luminance and drop the blue down, just to make sure everything is working to my liking. So I'll just touch the V key to bring it back into play. I'll touch the hand tool. We can go back over on the right hand side and select the hue, saturation and luminance. It's the saturation we need. Just going to drop that blue down a little bit. Look at the difference it makes. That's fine, I'm happy with that. But while I'm here, I may even look at the luminance by darkening that. So I'm not actually increasing the color of the sky, but I'm just darkening that blue down. Yes, I'm happy to live with that, so I'm happy to go back to my gradient, liven it up and think about anything I need to do. Have I got it coming down far enough? Yes, I think I probably have, and I think we're going to be able to improve on that a great deal. So maybe this is the time to hit the V key, sit back and just take a look. Now, one of the great things we can do with graduated filters is we can add one over the top of the other. Look at the top left of my sky. That is a little bit weak in comparison maybe to the rest. So what I could do here is pull down another gradient. Click and drag. Let me bring my overlay back in. Now that's obviously far too much. So if I go inside the gradient, right click and reset it all, then hide them again so I can see clearly what's going to happen, I could just tweak that down on the top left side just a little bit, maybe a touch more dehaze, just to give it that little bit of balance. Now when I do sit back and take a look at the picture, I start to look at the edge here, which I think is a little weak, and even this one here. But we know how to fix them. Let's pick up our gradient tool. I'm going to click and drag to bring that in a little bit. I'm going to right click to reset it, and I'll just hit the V key to get all of those overlays out of my eye line, so I can just tweak that down a little bit just to keep that edge nice. And then with those settings I'm going to put one over here, and you can see I can even drag it in without the overlay being seen. But here I think perhaps I need slightly less, but you know it's going to be personal. But you can see how powerful the graduated filter is. Here I have another image where I've done all of the foreground editing, and once I'm happy I've got that complete, and I've got a lot of impact in here, and I like the way this sort of sweeps into the picture, but the sky's weak. So I'm going to select my gradient. If you want to drag down a gradient and make sure it's absolutely straight, if you hold the shift key when you do so, you can see it sort of locks it into certain angles, but it also keeps it straight for you. So if you wanted to draw something like that nice and straight, as you can see, you can do it. But as soon as you start moving it, if you don't hold the shift key, then you can start to wander a little bit. So I'm going to touch the V key here to get rid of that overlay, and what I've got is just exposure, so I'll just double click to reset that. So what am I going to do here? Got a few dust spots in the sky that have to be fixed a bit later, but that's not the subject of the exercise here. Let's drop the exposure down. That looks okay, not too bad. Maybe a little dehaze in the sky. Ooh, that's way too much. Let's double click, reset that. Let's try a bit of clarity. That's not having a great deal of effect. A bit, but not much. Let's go back. I'll reset that and go back to my clarity, but I'll be a little bit more careful with it. That looks okay. Now I'm going to take a look at the temperature. Do I want to warm up the sky a bit? Does that balance better? Or would I prefer it to be a little more blue, because the blue does complement the warm yellow tones down here? It doesn't really matter what we choose, but just for the sake of argument, let's say we're going with blue. What we can also do here is click and drag another gradient. Now let me bring back my overlay, because what I'm going to do up here is click and drag one down, and I'll reset it, because we can add colour into the gradient. I think I'll touch the V key before I do this, because what I want to do is to be able to view what I'm doing without that overlay in place. So here I've got the opportunity of picking a colour. Now I can take a warm colour, even a pinky red. That looks a bit over the top, but don't forget I'm picking a real strong colour. I've still got my saturation here that I can temper the colour with that. So what I tend to do, this is just a personal choice, is I tend to pick something which I feel is appropriate, and then if I feel I need to drop it down, then I can do so. But if we wanted to add a different colour, then of course we can do that too. If I wanted to give a bit of a warm look and that doesn't look overly bad, I'll click OK. There we have another use of our graduated filter. There is one other option that we have with the graduated filters that I feel I need to mention. When we apply changes with the adjustment brush, if we go a little too far, of course, we can edit just one part of the brush. Well, we can do something very similar here with the graduated filter. If I just bring my graduated filters back, and maybe I just select this one, we can go up to an option at the top and we can click to create a brush. Now we may think, why would we want a brush when we've got graduated filters? But when we select it, we get the option to add or remove. So what we could do, if we've drawn down a gradient and we find that it's darkened down one area too much, here you can see I've got my brush here that looks exactly the same as the adjustment brush. If I found that it was darkening down that little bit too much, then I could use the minus and I could temper the effect of the gradient. But I could do the reverse too. If I felt there was one area that was a little weak in the gradient, I could add a brush to that, which is, I suppose, adding an adjustment brush over the top of the gradient, but I can do it in a positive way. Now I think the graduated filter is a great tool, and if you like this one, then you're going to like the radial filter too.